So what I want to do here is talk about some terminological confusion, right? We hear these terms, Marxism, communism, socialism, interchangeably. And the question we want to ask is, can we sort these terms out? And the answer is that it's really difficult to sort them out. And that's one of the reasons why I use this term economic structuralism, because it actually clearly says what it is that we're talking about the effects of economic structure on politics. Nonetheless, let me try to address these terms. So there are no clear definitional distinctions. Marx himself did not distinguish communism and socialism. People often use those terms interchangeably. Marx himself wrote a great volume of literature over a 30-year career. And so people argue about what Marx himself meant, and so actually about what Marxism means. There's a lot of disagreement about similarities, differences, and so on. Equally importantly, countries that we typically think of as being communist or having been communist, in fact, call themselves socialist. The Soviet Union was officially called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and actually they made a big deal in that country, that government did, about being very clear about what constituted socialism and when they could officially say that they'd moved on from socialism to communism. At least in that view, and in many views, communism is an extension or a further development of socialism. More extreme version, you might say. But they all share some basic ideas, right? They all share this idea of surplus value or of unequal exchange that I talked about in my previous video. The idea that the free market, as we typically conceive of it, is inherently exploitative. They all share that. They all share then a normative commitment to ending that, a normative commitment to reducing inequality. And then they all get to this question of who owns the means of production, who owns the most important parts of the economy, right? The factories, the land, and so on. That is to say, the main basic inputs of the economy. Because in all these schools of thought, that's where the real power is. The power is with control or ownership of the means of production. So what are some important differences? Well, in an extreme version of communism, for example, private property is more or less eliminated. Socialism and other schools of thought don't make a big deal out of that. Another big difference is democratic politics versus a dictatorship of the proletariat. A lot of people argue that you can run a fair society democratically. Others say that democratic politics itself is a construct of an exploitative capitalist world, and really you have to have the workers, a single committee of the workers running everything, that idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat. A really big question is who should own the means of production. In some versions, the workers should own it, right? So if we're talking about a Ford factory, the workers at Ford should own the Ford factory, and the workers over at General Motors should own their factories, and so on. There's another point of view that says all these things should be publicly held, right? And this is actually true in some things in some parts of the world. The Postal Service in this country is owned publicly. This university is owned publicly. So there are disagreements about what should be owned by whom. The extent of state ownership is also debated, right? Even if you agree that the state should own things, should the state own everything or just the really most important things? Even towards the end of the Soviet Union, they found that it was pretty helpful to allow people to own some small plots of land or to open small restaurants and shops, because that was a way of sort of filling in things that the state itself wasn't very good at doing. So that's an important debate. Now, those are the kinds of things that socialists and Marxists and communist theorists, however they identify themselves or label themselves, they spend careers on this stuff. Most of that is not really important for the study of international politics, and so we don't have to go any further into it. I do want to introduce an idea that I'm going to develop at a little more length in the future, is this idea of structural versus post-structural Marxism. Marx's theory was about structure, and most of what we think as conventional Marxism or socialism or communism is about structure. But later Marxists, and especially in the contemporary world, they don't focus so much on structure, but on cultural underpinnings of capitalism. Sometimes we use the term post-structuralism, sometimes we talk about critical theory. So I want to stress that in this course, when we talk about economic structuralism, I use that label because we're talking primarily about the sort of traditional structural approaches to how economics shapes politics. I think these are more important for international politics, and frankly, they're easier to understand. So that's why I use this term economic structuralism, but I want to be clear that in doing so, there's a lot of contemporary Marxism that you might learn about in other courses that we're kind of leaving out. So to finish, I want to ask a different version of a question I asked last time, which is, which parts of Marxism to you seem most and least controversial?